Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the coaching carousel and the big news around UNC and Bill Belichick. Very confusing, and we will update you on it as it unfolds. Feels like a decision could be coming today or tomorrow, so we'll definitely see what happens there. Going to be very interesting, one way or the other, no doubt about that. But let's get into this month of December. It is the most confusing time in college football by a fairly comfortable margin. Even in the middle of the season, it's a little bit less confusing than what December is because you got a million things happening. You have the portal, you have recruiting, you have trying to keep your guys in your building. You have obviously a bowl game coming up for a lot of these teams. So let's get into the teams that really stand out to me. There's obviously a lot more on this list, but in terms of where I'm standing, the teams that just have to be all over the place this year, it starts with the Michigan Wolverines. I think everyone understands this. This is the start of the Michigan transformation because you have the new quarterback. You have Bryce Underwood. Chip Lindsey is going to be your new offensive coordinator. The reality is a lot of stuff is going to change. That offense is going to have to fundamentally change in the way that operates. Obviously, you still want to be physical. You still want to be forceful at the line of scrimmage, and I tend to believe they'll still be able to do that. Bryce Underwood wants to throw the ball around. Bryce Underwood also wants to be a running threat in the game, so he is going to be a huge factor in the way they build out this offense and the way that they go get players in. They got to go get some wide receivers. They have to go load up on some elite wide receivers. There are some dudes out there. They need to start getting on the phone and see if they can find a couple of those guys. They also have to replace those two defensive tackles, and Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, two huge contributors, two huge reasons that defense was not all the way off a cliff this year, frankly. There was a lot of issues with that defense, particularly on the back end, but that front seven really kept them in the hunt for a lot of this year. Also, Will Johnson's out the door. Your best coverage corner, in my opinion, the best coverage corner in the entire country, is walking out the door. You got to figure out what you're going to do there. So a lot of stuff has to happen here in terms of personnel. There are quite a few gaps in terms of personnel on that roster. You just got to find new guys. You got to go out and be very aggressive. I assume Michigan will be one of the most active teams, probably both into and out of their program over the next month or so. Definitely will be a huge little bit for Jerome Moore. And then you got to get the new kid in there, and you got to see what you can do in 2025. Going to be a huge year, but the Michigan that you knew is kind of changing, at least offensively, and we'll see if this next month can kind of kickstart them into that. Oklahoma, you're staring down the barrel. There is no doubt about that. They are in a really, really interesting spot because the roster crisis is very real. They are losing guys left and right in the portal, particularly a ton of wide receivers from that wide receiver core. I believe Deion Burks might be the only pass catcher still around there, if I'm being honest. But Jackson Arnold, obviously out the door. That was expected by just about everyone around there. Danny Stutzman and a ton of other top defenders are off to the NFL. You got to be really active in the portal. You have to go out and get guys. They did a relatively good job pulling in a good high school class, but you need wide receivers, and you need them very, very badly. This is a very deep group. This is a group that you absolutely can get a couple from and be very successful, but the reality at the end of all of this, if you make all the right decisions, if you hit all the right buttons, you're probably going to have a very, very new defense. You're going to have an entirely new wide receiver core. You're going to have a new quarterback. You're probably going to need to get a lot of new offensive linemen. It's going to be tough. They have the ability to bounce back next year, get to 9, 8 wins, something like that. But the reality is you got to hit the right buttons in the next month. And even if you do that, the work is still very much ahead of you, and it's definitely going to be really tough. Oklahoma's always going to be a team that can bounce back and have a huge year. But when you look at that roster right now, there is a lot of work that needs to be done in the next month. And then you got to really get to work to make sure that everything falls into place the way that you want it to. The guy that Brent Venables' actually old boss, Dabo Sweeney, you need to get active. One way or the other, you need to get active. There have been a couple of different players that have said they've gotten calls from Clemson throughout the transfer portal. It has to be more, just plain and simple. This is a very talented team, and frankly, they're returning a ton of really, really young talent next year, whether it's the two wide receivers in Bryant Wesco and TJ Moore. Cade Klubnik will be back next year, a couple of defenders that will absolutely be huge. The reality is you need more because if you do not go into the portal, if you do not get active, if you do not get the players that you very much need, it's probably the last time we'll see Clemson on the national stage for a while, if I'm being totally honest. You have too many teams in that conference that are making big-time waves, that are starting to make moves, that are starting to get more talented and kind of close that gap between them and Clemson. They have to make sure that they widen it again. They have to make sure that they go out, get some big-time wide receivers, get a running back to take over Phil Moffa's spot, get a couple of defenders to take over some of the big-time spots that will be void after this year. So there's a lot of different things that have to happen over there. Obviously, they have a little bit more of that prerequisite just elite talent all over the roster where it's not quite as vital as some of these other teams, but when you look across that team right now, they're just not quite to that elite level. They're not quite to that national championship level. This month is where a lot of that stuff can change. There's no doubt about that. Miami is staring down a very interesting month because this was the year, and you came up short, just short of the CFP. You came up short of what you wanted to do, and there's a lot of outgoing talent. There's a lot of guys, particularly on offense, that are likely going to find their place elsewhere. Cam Ward off to the NFL, as Xavier Restrepo, likely Jacoby George. Maybe he'll stick around. Elijah Arroyo almost definitely is out the door. You're almost definitely losing Francisco Mauanoa on the defensive side as well, the quarterback of that defense. So you got to find replacements. They have plenty of talented guys from the portal last year, as well as recruiting classes that they've been starting to bring in. So they have guys as a prerequisite. They have that foundation that they need, no doubt about that. But you're going to need some game changers. You're definitely going to need some game-changing defenders. When you look at that defense right now, it has to be attacked very aggressively in the portal. You have to find new guys to fill those gaps in. You got to find better guys, plain and simple. The defense just wasn't good enough. The personnel, especially up front, was just not good enough. They have to be much better. They have to start developing these young guys that are very talented, especially on the back end of that defense. It's one of those things that this could be a worse offense next year, a better defense, and they can make the playoff. It starts right now. You got to make sure that you get the right guys in there, and then you got to find Cam Ward's replacement somewhere in this mess. Sounds like it could be Malik Murphy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail tomorrow. But definitely a lot of things that have to happen, and that's kind of the world that Mario Cristobal has chosen with the portal approach that he does have. Florida State, obviously they are going to be a part of the portal discussion. There's no doubt about that, but they were in the headlines for all the wrong reasons this year. They had one of the worst turnarounds that I've ever seen in all of my years of watching college football, and they need to get more involved in the high school ranks. You can't do that right now. You have to go get a portal class. You have to be able to turn this thing around next year, and then you can deal with the high school recruiting, and then you can get into really building this program out. It looks like Thomas Castellanos might be leaning in that direction right about now. It sounds like they're doing essentially all they can do to find a way to get him on campus and get him to be their quarterback. Very talented kid. A lot of people kind of raise their eyebrows at that. He is a Gus Malzahn quarterback, plain and simple. He fits that mold very, very well and would be a very interesting one, but I think could be a very successful one. Sounds like a couple of Nebraska defenders are trying to look that direction because Tony White, their defensive coordinator, made their way there. And then they just got to fill the cupboard with wide receivers. I know they're in for Barry and Brown. They're in for a couple other guys, but they got to get very, very active because this next month is going to decide Mark Norvell's future in Tallahassee. One way or the other, what guys he brings in this time around compared to what he brought in last year is going to make the decision. He brought in Malik Benson and DJU and I'm blanking on the last name, very talented players from the portal this past year. They weren't quite good enough. You got to get A-plus guys. You got to get guys that can take you to the CFP, that can get you back on the mountaintop. Really, really talented staff. Really, a lot of guys that I very much like on that team. You got to build it out, and you're losing guys kind of left and right. It's going to be a very busy month down there in Tallahassee. And then we'll move over to Gainesville. Why not? Florida is in launchpad mode as far as I'm concerned. They are in a position where you have DJ Lagway. You have finished the season really, really strong. You had nearly a top 10 class in recruiting. The portal is the final piece. The portal is the thing that can put everything into place. They have lost guys like Raheem Jackson, a very talented corner for them. Jack Pryburn, a very talented edge rusher. They've lost both those guys, and they're going to have to find a way to replace them. Definitely a lot of work to do to just make sure you have the guys around DJ. He can take you to a CFP. I can almost promise you that. He has the talent to take you to a CFP. He has the talent to possibly win you a national title. You got to make sure you get the talent around him. You got to make sure that over the next couple of weeks, you get wide receivers. You get a lot of talent on defense, and you get this thing where it needs to be from a talent perspective going forward. Colorado. They're always going to be in change. That's just kind of what they do. They are a place of change, no doubt about it. And the portal just opened, so it's Colorado season. They need help on both sides of the ball with a lot of guys going all over the place. They just lost Dayon Hayes yesterday, I believe, to the portal. Definitely a tough loss. Really talented player coming off the edge for them. Obviously, the news is Shadur Sanders and Travis Hunter. Those two guys are out the door. It means that everyone else on this team has to be that little bit better. Those two guys made up for a lot of deficiencies on that team throughout the last couple of years. It cannot happen next year because those two guys will not be on the field. So you're going to have to find new guys to fill the gaps. If it is going to be Julian Lewis starting for you at quarterback, you're really going to need a lot of help at offensive line, at wide receiver, at all of the positions that just make his job a lot easier. You need some help at running back. a lot of different things that are going to happen around Colorado, as it does really every single time around this time of year. Deion did it last year. I have no reason to believe he can't do it this year, and he's leading for a lot of really talented guys that we'll talk about a little bit later, probably tomorrow, in a little bit more depth. LSU, this is going to be a huge one. Brian Kelly is officially on his last life. 2025 is the last chance to prove that he can bring a national championship to Baton Rouge. Doesn't mean he has to win a national championship next year, but you got to get to the playoff. You got to show that you can make those steps forward. You got to show that you are a coach that can get them to the promised land that LSU belongs in. Let's just be totally honest. That's one of the best programs in the country. They belong in the playoff, or at least in that conversation. They were not this year. So the talent at wide receiver that is going out the door just needs to be filled. We already had CJ Daniels hit the portal. Kyron Lacey is going to go to the NFL. A lot of different moving parts here. So got to make sure you get that. The D-line, just stock to the gills. Get all of the guys you possibly can. Get all of the talent you possibly can. And then let Bo Davis and Kevin Peoples just work. They are incredible developers. They will get those guys ready to roll. And then the secondary, you have a lot of really young talent that I absolutely love. You got to backfill it with some really veteran guys that can make some plays. Definitely some guys out there, a couple of guys that are at the G5 level that I think could be hugely helpful to them. It'll be interesting to see what happens there, and definitely will be an interesting team. And then if Nussmeier comes back, this is a very capable team. You just got to hit the right buttons right now, and this next month is going to be huge for them and just about everyone else in the country. But especially those teams that I just listed, I feel like there's just a little bit added pressure. There's just a little bit more juice as you get into this month, and a lot of moves that have to be made. If they're not, you're going to come out on the wrong side in 2025. If they are, then you might just see a CFP team in 2025. So a lot of different questions, and a lot will be answered in the next month. We'll break it down as it does, obviously. But let's take our last break here. When we come back, let's rank the quarterbacks in the CFP field. I feel okay about this list. I love all these quarterbacks, so it was very, very hard to put together, but I'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.